It is my great pleasure and honor to introduce my good friend, Bill Ayers. He's a social justice organizer and activist and teacher. He was one of the founders of the Weather Underground, and when that epic protest against the Vietnam War concluded, he then switched to becoming a radical teacher. A former distinguished professor of education at the University of Illinois in Chicago. He's the author or editor of more than 30 books about teaching, social justice, urban school reform, and children in trouble with the law. Bill Ayers has published 2 memoirs, Fugitive Days and Public Enemy, that I recommend, and his one recent book, Demand the Impossible, a Radical Manifesto, but he's done a lot more since then. So, Bill, it's a great pleasure. Lead us in a conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Donna, and thank you all. Thank you to Prut for inviting me. Honored to be with you. I had said to Donna I would rather have a conversation. It's difficult to me. This medium of talking through Zoom has great advantages, but one of the disadvantages for me as a teacher and as a political organizer is I need to feel the energy in the room. I need to feel my comrades. So let's do our best to overcome the limitations and have a conversation. I want to just say 2 things in response to Donna's introduction. One is that I became a radical teacher in 1965 in the midst of the Black freedom movement in the United States, and I became part of the Freedom School movement. I later was a leader of Students for Democratic Society and the breakup of that and the break off into the Weather Underground. But I've never lost the the spirit and the energy of being a radical teacher. And by radical, I mean going to the root, trying to figure out what's at bottom, what not the superficial, but what's deeply at the bottom of what our enterprise is. So I continue to do that. I retired from the University of Illinois at Chicago 14 years ago when I was 65 years old. And when I was a full professor at UIC, I taught 2 classes a semester. You know, full professors don't have real jobs. They just have guaranteed income and hang out. But I did my best to use the opportunity to really push things. But I did retire 14 years ago. And I now teach 4 classes a term. So it was 2 classes when I was a working professor. I'm now adjuncting. I teach oral history at the University of Chicago. I teach curriculum and teaching at Lake Forest Academy. I teach ethics at DePaul University. And I teach memoir writing at Stateville Prison. And I may come back to that last teaching gig because that's the one that has me the most focused these days. I'm also going to talk mostly on the basis of a book I've been working on that is just going to come out in the spring. And the book is called When Freedom is the Question, Abolition is the Answer. And I'd like to invite you to interrupt me, and I don't know how to interrupt me because maybe Prakash or maybe Dada can jump in and stop me if you have questions or comments. I would love to have a back and forth, a conversation. But again, this medium makes that a bit more difficult than if I were in the room with you and I could see you agitatedly shaking your fist at me. Then I would definitely turn to you and we would go back and forth. But does that make sense, Prakash? I can see you. Should we just go forward like this and I'll talk a bit? And will you shake your fist at me when it's time for me to shut up? Yeah. I'm counting on you. All right. So let me just begin by offering a few. Well, I'll offer a few provocations. I would first like to note, which I tend to do not as a formality, but as a as a critical reminder. I have come to really embrace the idea of a land acknowledgement, and so I want to tell you that I'm speaking to you from the so-called Chicagoland area of Illinois, which I call a conundrum contained in a contradiction. I think of Chicago as both a confirmation, and a crime scene. And sometimes I imagine Chicago draped in that distinctive yellow crime scene tape, "Do not enter, criminal investigation underway." But it's important for me to note that these lands were stewarded for centuries, for millennia, by many indigenous peoples and lineages, including the Potawatomi, the Ojibwe, and the Odawa, as well as the Menominee, Miami, Ho-Chunk, Sauk, and Fox nations. These human beings raised their children here, created their communities, made sense and meaning of their lives together, experienced the flowing and the passing of time, and planned for the future and buried their dead here. So I think we should acknowledge them and thank them and apologize for the actions of our settler colonial forebears and join in solidarity in seeking truth, repair, and reconciliation. So I read that whenever I speak and whenever my podcast is, an episode of my podcast is aired. And as I say, I don't think that we should think of it just as a formality. I think we should think of it as a heartfelt embrace of history and a reminder that history never is past. It's with us today, and we should learn from it and grow from it. So, a few comments, and then open to conversation and your comments and critique and questions. So I start by asking the question: what is freedom? How do we get free? What are the freedom dreams that encourage us and drive us forward? If we're blinded to the social reality we're swimming through, who benefits from that blindness? Where are we on the clock of the universe? And what does the known demand of us now? Dada mentioned in the book, "Demand the impossible." I've admired that phrase for a long time. It's a phrase that was used by James Baldwin, the great American essayist and writer. It's a phrase used by Che Guevara. Why would we demand the possible when what we really need is to unleash our imaginations and demand the impossible? And so I'd like us to consider these questions. What is freedom? How do we get free? We might bind ourselves then together in a collective commitment to look at the world as if it could be otherwise. To look at the world as if it could be otherwise, and then get busy in projects of resistance and repair, and yes, of revolution. So this is a good time in my mind to reflect once more on the question of freedom, to explore its history, to illuminate its dimensions. The word freedom is practically appliqued onto our American minds. We're born free in the freest country on earth, we're told repeatedly. And it seems that individuals and corporations alike, people from the far left and the reactionary right, embrace freedom as a positive force and a trumpeted value. So we have the Freedom Caucus in Congress. We have Freedom Unlimited card from Chase Bank. We have Freedom Sanitary Napkins and the Courage to Be Free by Ron Santis. But we also have the Black Freedom Movement. We have gay liberation. We have women's freedom. So what does anyone mean by freedom in particular? The answer is difficult to pin down because we seem to be talking past and over each other. And I should situate us also a bit. And I think many of us feel this way, that this moment can absolutely feel like the worst of times. A new and escalating war with China, a hot and destructive proxy war in Europe, racialized police violence unchecked, environmental collapse on full display, fragile and often anemic democratic institutions seemingly on life support, religious authoritarianism on the rise, women's bodily integrity under sustained assault. The overlapping crises threaten to overwhelm us. But on a different day, or from a different angle of regard, these days can feel like the best of times. 26 million people took to the streets in 2020 in response to the police murder of George Floyd, the largest public outpouring of racial justice in history. Women across a wide political spectrum have refused to accept the medieval definition of their rights, and broad forces are on the march worldwide to resist plunder and extraction and to preserve life on earth. I wake up every day and glance at this sign behind me. It's by the poet Mary Oliver, and her words speak to me every morning, capturing a sense of the universal contradiction. It says, just to be alive on this fresh morning in the broken world. And that's how I feel every day, and I feel that way right now. I also think Charles Dickens would recognize our contemporary predicament at once: the winter of despair, the spring of hope, an age of foolishness, an age of wisdom, darkness in mortal combat with light. Dickens understood that life is never one thing in isolation from every other thing. And I want to really push that idea. Life is never one thing. What you're enthralled with is not the only thing going on. You may see exploitation, you surely do, but there's also resistance to exploitation. We can see progress, yes, and also backlash, but more than one thing is happening at once. And I get up, as I say, kind of living this contradiction, and I don't want to run from it. I want to dive into that contradiction. The worst of times, the best of times. If you don't know the writer Viet Thanh Nguyen, he's one of my favorites. He wrote The Committed and The Sympathizer. And in The Committed, he has this line early in the book. It's a novel, but this is his line. Ah, contradiction, the perpetual body odor of humanity. I love that phrase. And I think we should not run from contradiction, which is kind of the typical American and Western response, but we should dive into contradiction and hold on to it. So let me make maybe 5 or 6 small points about the problem or the question of freedom, and then urge you to talk back to me. Number 1, freedom is a living thing, and a vital aspiration is partially revealed when we look unblinkingly into the face of unfreedom. And so we feel the unfreedom, but we should look at it clearly and understand that freedom is understood best when we see unfreedom. So if unfreedom includes being prevented from voting, then freedom must involve the act of voting. It might not be the whole answer, but it must involve that. If unfreedom is in part being forced to attend underfunded, segregated, miseducating schools, freedom embraces integrating into the privileged schools and fighting for an honest curriculum. If unfreedom is policies and politics of caging and cruelty, exclusion and dehumanization, then freedom must unlock the cages and abolish those heartless practices. And talking to Prakash earlier, if unfreedom means astronomical rates of infant mortality among African American people and people of color, then freedom must involve fighting for the right of humanity to exist, for life to live. So freedom, in my mind, is always freedom in opposition. And it's naming what we're opposed to that's so important. Identifying unfreedom, of course, must carry with it a moral imperative, the responsibility to act. I'm thinking of Nina Simone talking from the stage at Summer of Soul concert in Harlem in 1969. And she said, in the middle of one of her classic tirades about white supremacy, Nina Simone said, "Don't just sit there, for God's sake, do something." And freedom, that means to me that freedom is an achievement to be won, not a gift to be bestowed. It has no direct link to charity. It's not a grant from a philanthropic foundation, nor the largesse of some Lady Bountiful, some ostentatious benefactor. Freedom must be seized rather than received. And that's as true now as it ever was. Freedom now, as you know, was the call to arms of the Black freedom movement in the 1950s and 1960s, the massive social justice movement that generated real social change, as well as a language, a philosophy, and a vast soundtrack that contingently defined and then continually redefined the meaning of freedom. And so we all know songs like We Shall Overcome and Oh Freedom, and woke up this morning with my mind on freedom. I want to interject here that at the 1963 March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, where Martin Luther King Jr. gave his iconic I Have a Dream speech, the young leader of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, John Lewis, was 23 years old at the time, and later became a legendary congressman from Georgia. He said this: "We do not want our freedom gradually, we want it now. We're tired of being beaten by police. We're tired of seeing our people go to jail again and again. Wake up, America, wake up. And I wanted to read John's short quote there in this context, because we're in a place where people are saying, go to sleep, don't pay attention, don't wake up. And John Lewis said this in 1963, and we can echo it today. We can't be free if we don't wake up. That's essential. Second point, in the wake of the Black Freedom Movement, a liberating spirit was loosed on the land. Freedom's energy was unleashed and a new world heaved into view. Everything felt like music, and the music felt like freedom. Abolishing all forms of subjugation became the agenda and kept pushing forward. So in the wake of the Black Freedom Movement, we find the next wave of women's liberation, a surge of grassroots truth-telling. We saw the rise of Puerto Rican independence. It seemed suddenly possible. American Indian movement warriors organized and stood tall for their people's freedom. Gay liberation, Chicano liberation, disability rights, all of that was suddenly on the move and in the mix. And the reason, I believe, is because freedom dreams are contagious. And in today's terms, freedom dreams were going viral. So freedom is tied to protest and resistance, to community building and solidarity, to collectively identifying the barriers to one's or one's neighbor's humanity, and then struggling arm in arm, shoulder to shoulder, heart to overcome those obstacles. Freedom is neither a passive state of being nor a stable state of being, but an active state of engagement. Freedom was something to be accomplished in dialogue and in struggle with others. Freedom pointed toward perpetual personal fulfillment, yes, but always in the dynamic, ongoing development of sisterhood and brotherhood, community action, collective liberation. A third point about freedom. This is that freedom, there is a paradox in my mind that lies at the heart of freedom. We are perhaps most free when we're standing in front of an imposing wall, naming a roadblock to our own or our neighbor's full humanity, and then throwing ourselves against that obstacle. You know, it's just not true that freedom is someone sitting on their couch watching TV and smoking a joint. I'm not against that. I'm just saying that's not where freedom lives. Freedom pitches into view precisely when the wall of unfreedom is identified: enslavement, subjugation, abuse, cruelty, persecution, extraction, oppression. And then we reach for a sledgehammer to break through that wall. Fred Moten, the great cultural theorist, has said that freedom dreams at their best were born in the dark and deadly hold of a slave ship. Precisely. It's when we see that we're not free and act against it that we become free. So I'm thinking of a couple of quick examples. One is at the 1968 Democratic Convention, I was arrested with many other people in an unrallying mass, a chaotic street fight with the police along Michigan Avenue. And when we were packed into a crowded police van rushing toward Cook County Jail, I was badly injured and I had a bleeding head and I ached all over. And I was practically ecstatic with the feeling of freedom. The whole world was watching. We had stood up. We had stood our ground. We had not retreated, and I felt free. Now that is, to my mind, a paradox. And it reminds me of several other stories. Just a couple, for example, Frederick Douglass tells an amazing story in his autobiography about the one time when he stood up to his master's son who had picked up a whip to beat him. And Douglass got into a physical fight with this guy and he backed down. And he said, and Douglass's comment at the time was, I was nothing before, but I was a man now. After resisting him, I felt I had never felt before. It was resurrection. I'd reached a point where I was not afraid. This spirit made me a free human being. In fact, when a slave cannot be flogged, he is more than half free. That's the great Frederick Douglass. There are many other examples, but I'll I'll just leave you with that. The paradox of freedom, acting against unfreedom, even from prison, even Nelson Mandela, or even the French resistance, they felt free because they were naming unfreedom and acting on it. The fourth point I want to make is that, and it gets to the question of individual freedom and community liberation. Each one of us is the one of one, full stop. There will never be anyone like you ever again. We each have a unique and important, and it's why we should treat other people with absolute awe and honor, because each of us is the one and only who will ever walk this earth, full stop. At the same time, we're each one of the many. We are just one of the many. We are each born, we each suffer, we will each die. And that makes us exactly like everybody else on some important dimensions. Once again, a contradiction. But I'm drawn to the poem that's at the base of the Statue of Liberty by Emma Lazarus, the socialist poet from Europe. And everyone knows the part of the poem on the Statue of Liberty that says, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door." Now, Lazarus called the poem "Mother of Exiles," and of course, there's an irony there. Rita Dove, the poet laureate of the United States, was visiting Lower Manhattan at a time when the statue was shrouded in construction rigging. And as she was visiting the Statue of Liberty in Battery Park, looking out at the statue in the harbor, right in front of her was a homeless woman wearing a cap, big boned, sitting heavily. And Rita Dove writes a brilliant, brilliant poem, which you should look up. I could read it, but I won't. It's called Lady Freedom Among Us. And what Dove does is she describes the woman and she describes the statue in contrast to each other. This lady, the homeless woman is unhoused, unfed, unfree. She's in front of our eyes, and she makes a mockery of the statue's aspirational legend. And so Dove's poem really is an attempt to say, this lady in front of us, you cannot deny her with her old-fashioned sandals, her leaden skirts. She is one of us, she is each of us. Here the poet illuminates that fundamental contradiction that I started with. We're each fully the one of one, full stop. We are each merely one of the many. Again, full stop. Fifth point I'd like to make is that we are, each of us and all of us, also stricken with a certain fear of freedom. We actually are more comfortable with orthodoxy, with rules, than we are with the reality of freedom. And it's worth noting this. I mean, if you think of something like Dostoevsky's Grand Inquisitor, where Jesus, you may know, you undoubtedly know the story. Jesus has come back. He's immediately arrested and imprisoned by the church. And the Grand Inquisitor comes to his cell and says to him, we had to arrest you, and we're going to have to kill you again, because people don't want freedom. They don't want to be free, and you're offering them freedom. You should allow us, the church, to let people live comfortably with their received wisdom, with their dogma, with their orthodoxy, and don't confuse them with the idea that freedom is a possibility for them. This theme is echoed everywhere. I'm thinking of Ray Bradbury's short story. I'm thinking of Bertolt Brecht. I'm thinking of Ray Bradbury, Fahrenheit 451, where you may remember the novel Fahrenheit 451, the story. It's about a fire department whose job is to burn books. And when the fire captain is asked, why do you do this nasty work? He says, the people want us to. Adjectives and adverbs are just too confusing. What we want is rules to live by. We don't want to be free. And I think that it's important to look that in the face. I often think of the great French philosopher Sartre, who tells an amazing, iconic story about being visited by a student during World War II when the Nazis were occupying France. And the graduate student comes to Sartre and says, I need your help. I need your help because I have a horrible dilemma. The dilemma is that my mother is dying of cancer and I have to stay home and take care of her. But my father has collaborated with the Nazis, and I feel I must join the resistance in order to save the family name and in order to stand up for what's morally right. So what should I do? And Sartre spends a long time, several hours, talking to the young student, and then says, well, you should choose. And the student says, I know, I have to choose. That's why I came to you, because I want you to help me choose. You're the great philosopher. And Sartre says, the problem with freedom is that there are no guarantees, and your choice belongs to you. It's your responsibility. And the student gets angry and says, well, then to hell with you. I'm going to go visit a priest. And Sartre says, very well, what priest will you choose? What priest will you choose? And I often tell that story when I'm asked advice by anyone. My niece 30 years ago asked me if she should move in with her boyfriend. And I told her the story of Sartre. And I said, why am I your priest? And she said, oh, so it is okay. And I said, wait, you could have chosen your mother as your priest. You could have chosen your grandmother, my mother, as your priest, but you chose me because you think I agree with what you want to do. Be free, make a choice, and take responsibility. So freedom is a horrible, horrible responsibility. Point 6, freedom takes courage. And authentic courage is at the heart of moral reflection and the moral instinct leading to ethical action. So, moral courage is not picking the box marked good and rejecting the box marked bad in a clean and decontextualized social field of obvious alternatives. That's a myth. Those happy labels could as easily be called conventional and unconventional, because most of us, most of the time, act conventionally and assume that we're being good people. The reality is, most Spartans act like Spartans. Most Athenians act like Athenians. Most Americans act like Americans. And so claiming to be a good person because you acted conventionally is crazy. And, I often, with my students, I often say, could a slave owner who was also a brilliant philosopher and never beat his wife and always paid his bills on time, could the slave owner be considered a moral person or even a free person? And my students wrestle with that and they struggle with that question. But it's the same question we should ask of ourselves today. We're all against slavery today. We're all abolitionists. But what are we not seeing today that is the conventional way of living that is also oppressive, cruel, exploitative? What do we need to demand of ourselves in order to make real moral choices and to really be free? Opening our eyes is part of it. We have to open our eyes, see the world as it is, and not once, but every day anew. And then we have to be astonished at both the beauty, the ecstasy, the humanity in every direction, and be astonished as well at all the cruelty and unnecessary suffering that we visit upon one another. Then we have to do something else. As I said earlier, we have to act. And once we act, we have to doubt. And that's the circle that, to me, is the circle of a moral person or a good activist or an organizer or a good teacher. We open our eyes and pay attention. We wake up, not once, but continually. We are astonished at both the good and the bad. We act and we doubt and we repeat. That, to me, is what it means to be free. And that's a form of, self-suffering, but it's essential. Finally, freedom is linked to abolition. When freedom is the question, abolition is the answer. And when I say abolition, I'm not talking about, freeing the slaves particularly, or opening the prison gates particularly, although I'd love to talk about that. I'm talking about a politics that says when freedom is on the agenda, there's really only one answer, and the answer is abolition. A friend of mine told me the story recently about reading a book to her 4-year-old son about the water keepers in Canada, the grandmothers who were fighting to save the water from oil companies that plan to drill and extract from the earth. And it's a beautiful story of courage of these old women. And at the end of the story, the 4-year-old said to his mother, "I want to join the grandmothers. I want to go on the picket line." And she said, "If you went on the picket line, what would your sign say?" And he said, "It would say no pipelines." He wasn't saying an alternative route for pipelines. He wasn't saying carbon trade-offs. 4-year-olds understand instinctively that when freedom is the question, abolition is the answer. The brilliant and intrepid geographer abolitionist Ruth Wilson Gilmore argues that the abolitionists of today, standing on the shoulders of the abolitionists who preceded us, are required to change just one thing, and that one thing is everything. Abolition is not best understood as a deletion or an erasure or an unlocking of doors, but rather as a collection of creative and complex acts of world building. What would it be in 1850 to imagine a world without slavery? What kind of world would we need to build in order to have no slavery? And what kind of a world could we begin to create today that would render prisons and police and militarism and war obsolete, predation and exploitation relics of a cruel past? Sometimes I like to think about 100 years from now, visiting the Museum of Capitalism or the Museum of Mass Incarceration, because those things are relics from some dark age. But to do that, everything would have to change. And that's why I think abolition is a politics, and abolition work, that is the work of changing everything, is the practice of freedom. I will stop there.